Hello and welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. My guest on the show this week is Kern, an author whose work I came across only recently. Alongside being a published author, Sim is a content creator using Instagram and TikTok as key tools in their activist life, making videos that inform, educate, and empower. Sim is an anti-Zionist Jew, dedicating huge amounts of time to the Palestinian liberation movement while dismantling Israeli propaganda and narratives about the Zionist colonial project. At the time of recording, the genocidal war on Gaza has been taking place for almost 4 months, with over 30,000 people having been killed in Gaza. Over 1 million people have been displaced from their homes and are starving, living without clean water, shelter, healthcare, and have nowhere safe to go. Kern is a Gulf Coast author and environmental journalist writing about climate change, queer identity, and social justice. Their debut horror novella, Depart, was selected for the honour list for the 2020 Otherwise Award. Their short story collection, Real Sugar is Hard to Find, was hailed in a starred review by Publishers Weekly as a searing, urgent, but still achingly tender work that will wow any reader of speculative fiction. As a journalist, they report on petrochemical polluters and drag space billionaires. Sim's latest novel is called The Free People's Village, set in an alternative reality of 2020 where a war on climate change has been announced. Just before we get on with the show, I want to remind you that you can support this very podcast. Come and find me on Patreon at patreon.com/thediversebookshelfpodcast and subscribe. When you subscribe, you could get access to an exclusive episode every month sent directly to your inbox. Every subscription helps me produce more episodes just like this and will support the show. Now, I'm so glad that Sim's my guest today. Let's get on with the show. Hi, Sim. Welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf podcast. Thank you so much for joining me. It's such a pleasure to have you on the show. How are you doing?
I'm great, and thank you so much for having me here.
Honestly, full disclosure, I came across you and your work just over the last few months, really with all the wonderful things you're doing online in talking about what's happening in Palestine, combating some of the myths that are out there about the situation, about the history, about Zionism more generally. And you're doing absolutely fantastic work. And, it's no surprise to me that the work that you do, the books that you're writing are also so thoughtful and so impactful. Yeah, I'm very new to you and your work, and actually, I'm in the UK, and your books are actually published in the US. A little bit difficult to get hold of over here at the moment, but maybe that will change. So I look forward to be able to read more of your work as well. But I want to talk a little bit about yourself. So you are Jewish, and you grew up with a Jewish family, and in any family, no two people are the same, no two people relate to religion and culture in the same way. But what was it like for you in terms of some of the ideas that you had about Palestine and about Israel growing up?
Yeah, my nuclear family was very secular Jewish, so we weren't, going to temple and things like that. And so I think that one of the reasons it was much easier for me to step, out of sort of Zionist indoctrination was I just didn't get that much of it. It was more my extended family and our extended Jewish community where I would sort of absorb those Zionist ideas from them. And I think the line in my family growing up, and we've all, I think, in my nuclear family at least, moved away from this, but the teaching was Jews and Arabs just hate each other. This has been going on for thousands of years, and it's tragic on both sides, and no one can solve it. Mm. And so it was and I kind of believed that until, I was in college. I started to meet, I went to Oberlin College, which was very left wing. And I met some anti-Zionist Jews for the first time and started to sort of question those things. And then it was really reading that helped break down that mythology that actually this isn't thousands of years old, that there was, thousands of years where Jews were actually getting along much better in Arab countries than they were in Christian Europe. And that, the intensity of this conflict really started with Zionist aggression, within my grandparents' lifetime. And so it was reading and, reading diversely and starting to read Palestinian authors that really broke that down for me. And learning the true history of the region has helped me realize that it is my Jewish values and the things that I was taught as a young Jew about, never again, this is what a Holocaust looks like. This is what a genocide looks like. If you're not raised to dehumanize Palestinians to such an extent that you don't even see them as people, then it's very easy to look at what's happening in Israel and see that this is a genocide, that this has been an apartheid state, that this is wrong, So yeah, that's kind of been my journey towards this activism.
Mm-hmm. So what was it really like, as you sort of read more widely and you came to understand maybe the reality of the situation and understood the history a little bit better and saw that it's not as complex as it has been made out to be? And what was that sort of like, that internal shift, and was there any like difficulties in communicating with your community about that?
Yeah. I mean, there's people who, because of, when I started becoming vocally anti-Zionist and especially putting these things online, for years there were like strains with certain people that I'm close with, but we just sort of didn't talk about Israel. Mm-hmm. And that was, we just didn't have that. Since October 7th, it became impossible not to talk about it with those people. And, some of those relationships are ended, and it's sad. Like, things were said that cannot be unsaid. And it's just not, when you see this much death and suffering, and you have to speak out, and it becomes more important than preserving relationships with people who are going to condone that sort of thing. Even though I know it is sadly the indoctrination, it is the context of their lives that has led them to just really, again, I think it's the dehumanization. They just really don't see Palestinians as people, and they are not aware of how much they have been conditioned to dehumanize Palestinians and how much racism they have. And people don't generally, they don't take well to being called out on racism. There's a lot of white fragility there. And, unfortunately, there's a lot of Jews still stuck in that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think people like to be called out on like the sort of racist ideas that we don't even sometimes realize that we have, and also privilege. I think we don't like to be made aware of how privileged we really are and what some of the big consequences of that really is. One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is the spectre almost of fear around anybody who speaks out about Palestine being labelled anti-Semitic. As a Muslim, and as a visibly Muslim woman, I wear hijab, this is a real issue for me in particular. And I think I have a whole array of feelings and thoughts about this issue, especially because, I have my community, my people, myself. We also experience a huge degree of Islamophobia, and the conflict, when we look at the conflict and some of the language that is being used around the Zionist narrative is inherently Islamophobic. But anyway, going back to this issue of sort of conflating a criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, I wondered what your thoughts and perhaps your experience and your insight on that are.
Yeah, and I think, that the conflation of Israel and Judaism as a whole plays right into Israel's hands. And so I would really discourage anyone who is pro-Palestine from, using any anti-Semitic propaganda or conflating Jews as a whole, saying Jews when you mean Israelis. You can say Israeli Jews, but that anytime you're collapsing Jews and Israel together, that's only strengthening Israel's position. that is exactly what they want the world to think. And I think that's why it's so important for anti-Zionist Jews to really step up in this moment, and always, and be vocally, visibly contradicting that message and saying, I'm Jewish and I support a free Palestine and a ceasefire and U.S. military aid to Palestine and all the things. And to say that, and to go further, learning the history. And I also say Israel should not exist there should not be an ethno-nationalist state. There shouldn't be a state just for the Jews, where Jews have superior rights to other people. I'm opposed to that form of government in any situation. I think there should be equality. And so, that it's really important for Jews to be out front saying those things. To me, the greatest anti-Semitism in the world right now is all coming from Israel. I mean, that's the way I see it. I see the greatest threat to Jews worldwide is Israel. For example, before October 7th, the one thing that I talked about often on my channel was combating anti-Semitic tropes in fiction, and how authors can avoid these anti-Semitic tropes, such as blood libel, which was this, lie in Christian Europe for, about 1,500 years. We see evidence of this, of Christians accusing Jews of drinking babies' blood and stealing Christian children and drinking their blood. And that is really deeply steeped into that blood libel lie was used to, genocide Jews for, again, many, many centuries. And it's really steeped into our fantasy literature. So often authors, will unintentionally include these anti-Semitic tropes in their fiction, not realizing that, you've created this very old archetypal Jewish villain character who's part of a secret shadowy society that steals babies and drinks their blood. Well, when Israel is doing things like literally harvesting people's organs, when they are so bloodthirsty and violent against the Palestinian people, they are mass killing children, they are enacting this trope that there's so much conspiracy theories about. There's so much, they're giving so much fodder to anyone who is primed to have these anti-Semitic ideas. If they look at what Israel's doing and they see Israel as the same as Jews, they're getting all of the evidence and ammunition that they need. And that's extremely dangerous for Jews in the U.S. who do not drink babies' blood. I want to be clear about that. That is not a part of Judaism. What the Israeli army does is just this violent genocidal army. It's just, indefensible. And so, that's why I see Israel as the greatest anti-Semitic force in the world. But if you watch the Western media, if you listen to anything that 99% of politicians are saying, you're going to hear the upside down of that.
Yeah, absolutely. That I had no idea about that blood sucking, drinking baby's blood libel that you just spoke about. That's really interesting. And also actually to reflect on the fact that, it does almost, there is an inherent connection that whatever the state of Israel is doing, that the Jewish community is going to feel in the impact of that and almost be connected to it in a way that's very difficult to detach yourself unless you are speaking out, and not everybody is speaking out. And I think one of the things I feel like is so important now more than ever is for us just to understand the very basic facts. And I think, Rashid Khalidi talks about this very well as well. And he always says that, we need to arm ourselves with at least a basic understanding of what is going on and what has happened, just actually so we can, for ourselves, differentiate between the Zionist propaganda and what is actually happening, and for us to be able to defend ourselves when people say to us a defense of Palestine, a criticism of the state of Israel is anti-Semitic. And I just wondered if you could take a moment, because I know you are also very well informed and very eloquent on this matter, what would you say to anyone that's looking to be well armed in this, how can we turn around and say a criticism of the state of Israel is not anti-Semitic?
Yeah, well, I agree with Khalidi that, reading, and the whole point of this podcast, which is that reading is really, really helpful here. I think that, I've gotten much better just over the last 4 months at like dealing with and countering the Israeli talking points that like come up so often in my, comments of my videos and things. And Holidy's book is a great place to start. Yeah. The 100 Years War on Palestine. It is, though, quite dense and academic. I know some people were like picking it up and wanting to read it and struggling to get through it, which is why I started my series, like summarizing each chapter of the book, which people can find that on my YouTube channel. I would still really encourage people to read the book because like each of my summaries is 10 minutes of a chapter that really just can touch on like 2 or 3 key points from that chapter, whereas there's like so much more content in there. It's like really a jam-packed book full of history. And I really found myself, after I had just finished reading it, I was doing a press conference at City Hall, for Palestine, calling for a ceasefire from our city council. And there was like a journalist who was he was asking me some gotcha question. I don't remember what it was, but he was a sympathetic, but he was like giving me the, propaganda line or whatever. And I was able to just like draw on so much of what I had read in Holidy's book and be like, well, actually, here's why in 1967, this and that. Like he was really trying to get me with like an older, do you know your history type question? Mm-hmm. And I did. So I wasn't able to be like tripped up by that. And so I think, professional Zionists who are online and, in people's comments and are seeking to confuse the issue and muddle the issue, they know the history, their version of it very, very well. Israeli education, starting in kindergarten, they're learning how to rationalize the state of Israel. And they're very well versed in it by the time that they are, adults. And so we also have to be very well versed in factual history that is not propaganda, in history told from a Palestinian perspective. So Alon Pape's books, Rashid Khalidi. I really like, for people who don't have that much time to read, I really like Joe Sacco's Palestine, which is a graphic novel, pretty quick crash course on events from the Nakba up until the 1990s. And then I think for me, I also really encourage people to read fiction because I think that internalizes, when I read nonfiction, it does kind of sometimes go in one ear and out the other. I forget the lists of facts and everything. But when you've read a fictional novel that really touched your heart and you've fallen in love with these characters and walked in their shoes as they're fleeing the Nakba or whatever it is, that stays with me longer. Mm-hmm. A powerful scene like that can stay with me for many, many years. So I recommend, Hala Alian, Susan Abulawa. Raja Shahada is a memoirist who I've read 2 of his memoirs. They're really powerful. So, and some of the older authors, lately I've been reading some of the more classic Palestinian literature. So Ghassan Kanafani and Emil Habibi to sort of get a more historical perspective on how the literature of Palestine has developed.
Yeah, so I recently read a memoir by Agatha Karmi, and it's called In Search of Fatima. And she was 8 years old or something. She was very, very young at the time of the Nakba of 1948. And her family left Palestine, and she's now actually living in the UK. And actually what I found in that memoir, and it's like 450 pages, it's quite long, was just the level of detail about things that you don't even think about. And I think it helps give such a bigger picture and such a more detailed understanding of how really like what we mean when we're talking about the Nakba, what we mean when we're talking about displacement. Like one of the things she writes about is bank accounts and how people lost their money. And how there was just one day where her father decided to withdraw cash. So he withdrew all of their savings. But his friends, they waited. And then the next day, they tried to go and withdraw money from the banks. But Israeli forces had taken over the banks and had refused to give them their money. And basically, they were without money. And it took like decades of going through the courts to eventually get some form of compensation. But they had lost so much money. And my mind was completely blown because that's something I I had not thought about that level of detail. But if you understand something, a small detail, a minor detail like that, if you understand that, you understand how exactly people's lives have been completely demolished, but also the huge ramifications of that, not just for one person, but for millions of people. And so I think that fiction can really bring alive some of that detail and some of the, what ends up being sort of like footnotes in fiction, in nonfiction, stuff that gets overlooked or maybe slightly glossed over, but it really brings it to life, I find.
So I just also learned this fact from Raja Shahada's memoir, We Could Have Been Friends, My Father and I. Mm-hmm. And I also didn't know that Israel just stole all of Palestinians' money. Mm-hmm. They, like you said, they took over the banks and they just took everybody's money. They did eventually get it back, though. And it's so funny. You mentioned that the court case, Raja Shahada's father, Aziz Shahada, was the lawyer who eventually won the court case to get some kind of compensation back.
Oh, wow.
So the memoir is about his father. And like Shahada didn't even like really understand and realize this until like many years after his father had died. He didn't realize how much his father had been like involved in the struggle to like get this money back. So anyways, it's just an interesting connection. And yeah, that was also a fact that I didn't know. I mean, there's just so much evidence of Israel's egregious crimes that the more you dig into it, it's hard to hold it all in your head even, and it becomes really undeniable once you start reading about Palestinian experiences, what's happening here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, obviously fiction and memoirs. I think I really only really maybe like the past couple of years I've really gotten into reading memoirs. I think there's a lot that we can learn from them. But I want to talk a little bit about the publishing industry during this time, because I think all kind of like industries, anything associated within the capitalist structure has been just really alarming and very shocking in their behavior at this time. Is we've sort of seen and we understand, I think, more than ever now, these big corporations and these big structures, how they feed the Zionist narrative machine, and sort of what the aim of that is. But the publishing industry has been, there have been a number of issues. There has been a lot of silence, I think, which quite possibly is one of the largest things. But we've also seen, some publishers have sort of demoted Palestinian authors. We know that Palestinian authors or authors that are speaking out for Palestine have been denied spaces for talking. It's a lot of silencing and censorship. What has been, if anything, your experience over the last few months with regards to the publishing industry? Because you are a writer, you are an author, and you are very vocal.
Yeah. So I, in a way I made my bed like early on, because I didn't start talking about Palestine on October 7th.
Yeah.
I've had a Canary Mission profile for a couple of years now. Okay. So, and in my book, The Free People's Village, so this is my book that came out in September, I very purposefully made the final scene of the book is set at a rally for a free Palestine. And I include the words like from the river to the sea in the text of the novel. And inside the front cover, there's like a map of the protest occupation. And it says like young Palestinians, Jews against apartheid are like listed there as like different groups. So like this book is calling for a free Palestine within the text. And I did that purposefully. One, because I was so inspired by the Palestinian organizing in Houston is just incredible. I mean, yesterday, our PYM and SJP shut down traffic to the airport with a car blockade. Like Houston doesn't turn out and protest the way New York or Oakland or LA do. Like we don't have that protest culture there, except we have a huge and really engaged Palestinian community here. And they do the most inspiring organizing that I've like seen around the city. So it was really, I wanted to include that in my book because I wrote it at a time, it was like after the 2020 protests had been shut down so brutally by cops. And, there was a lot of also like really inspiring Black organizing going on that summer, but it was like so brutally cracked down upon with tear gas and cops and kettling and, people getting arrested and injured. And, then for months there was sort of nothing. Everyone was kind of like licking their wounds and wondering what was next. And then there was it was either late 2020 or early 2021. There was this, it was in 2021. There was an outbreak there was bombing in Gaza, and Palestinian community in Houston responded. And it was like sort of the first major protest that had happened since the summer of 2020. And it was just really inspiring. There was a de-arrest. Cops actually pulled a Black guy, like one Black person out of the crowd to arrest him. And the Palestinian community just like surrounded the cops, and we were chanting like, let him go, let him go. And it was actually a successful de-arrest, which I had never seen that before. So, and we also, one thing I had never seen in Houston was being able to take over the streets around the mall in the Galleria, which are these like 6-lane roads that it's just, there were a number of protests there because it's like the center of capitalism. It's this enormous mall in the heart of Houston, but very difficult to get a protest going there that's big enough to shut down the streets. And this protest did. So I ended up making that like the setting of the final scene of the book. Anyways, all that to say, like, when I went on sub with that book, I found my agent with that book, and my agent ended up being Rebecca Podos, who is also an anti-Zionist Jew who organizes the Books for Palestine auction every year. So like I found my people, and then the editor of the book is like also from Irene Vasquez, is also from Houston, queer Afro-Latina editor, and is like done anti-Zionist organizing in Houston, like as well. So I found my people by just being honest about my politics in my fiction. And so when October 7th happened, I knew at least if I spoke out, like I know my agent and my editor are on my side, and they have been posting about Palestine every single day as well alongside me. Mm-hmm. So when you're honest about your politics and you're upfront about them from the beginning, then you don't have to, then you're going to find your people. You don't necessarily experience like as many repercussions, or I don't have to be afraid like, oh, what if I say something, what's going to happen? But that being said, moving beyond those two people, I'm looking at trying to sell another book soon that I'm finishing up. And, I don't know what my options are going to be for that because of my vocal activism. The Free People's Village came out in September, and it's of course like awards eligible for 2023 awards, but it's gotten like, despite being like very highly reviewed, very highly anticipated, USA Today bestseller. I haven't heard anything that hasn't so far received any awards nominations. And obviously it could be on the strength of the merit of the book, and it's out from an indie press. It doesn't have as big of a publisher behind it. But I do wonder, like, are people are really wary right now of, giving an award or something to anything connected to Palestine or anyone speaking out about Palestine, because they will get backlash and it will be a whole big thing.
Mm. That's such a shame, because Etaf Room, who is American Palestinian, she had a book come out at the very end of September. I think it came out in the UK and the US at the same time, called Evil Eye.
Evil Eye, yeah.
And it came out at the end of September, and there was noise about it at that time. But then since October 7th, this is the like silence. And she I mean, I've had her on the show actually twice already, and she has commented on that. She has felt that there hasn't been enough promotion of the book, and it's just really difficult to see that. And also Sahar Mustafa, who's written a book called The Beauty of Your Face. She's also Palestinian American, and she tells a story. It's an intergenerational story of a Palestinian family living in America. She said that she's had been told quite explicitly by her agents that a story centering Palestinians is not likely to get published. And so it feels absolutely devastating and just very confusing and very like rage inducing as well that this is happening. And I'm so glad that at least your book was published by a press that share your values and what understanding accepting of your politics. And it sounds like they have similar values as well, which really helped, I guess. But yeah, I mean, you know, I really hope that the books that you're working on find a good home. But it feels very scary, because I guess the other side of what we're seeing, I mean, in Palestine is in Gaza especially is the targeting of storytellers and authors and writers and journalists. And this is part of genocide. This is part of erasure, is to eliminate and to target culture and stories, because it's not just about killing people right now, it's about completely erasing them almost and telling history in a certain way. Just very difficult to hear about, and to it feels very scary.
And I want to point out too that none of this like shadow banning of Palestinian voices in publishing did not start on October 7th.
Yeah.
Hani Noricott is a YA writer, also involved with the Books for Palestine author auction. And she was on sub with a book, you know, for years, you know, a young adult Palestinian story, and was told multiple times, and she's been vocal about this on social media, just like, we love this, we'd publish it, but you need to change the character from Palestinian to just being Arab. Like, can we market this as just an Arab story rather than a Palestinian story? Because that's the only way they were willing to sell that book. And she, of course, refused. So definitely, I just don't want people to think, like, even after 2020, when it was like, publishing was like, we're so diverse, we're going to be anti-racist, we're going to publish diverse voices, there was one group of people that was still very blatantly being shut out, and that was Palestinian authors. And that's why I'm so passionate about reading and, you know, sort of championing Palestinian authors as well, because the ones that do get published, man, they're always really good books, because they had to overcome so many hurdles. You know, they had to be amazing to get through that blockade. So.
Yeah, it just reminds me actually obviously since October 7th, actually, Etaf Room has come under fire a lot by some of her readers who are not happy about her stance on Palestine, which obviously she is very pro-Palestinian. And one of the things she talks about is also, and she's been published by HarperCollins, and her first book, A Woman Is No Man, features a very aggressive male protagonist who is violent towards his wife, and like, just, you know, unspeakably violent. And basically she's written about, you know, performative reading and performative empathy, and feels as though the reason why some readers, and maybe a lot of her readers, championed that book so much was because the male protagonist already fueled an idea they had about Palestinian men and Muslim men, which is that they are violent. And so some of the backlash she received was like, well, if you've told us that Palestinian men are violent, why are you now defending Palestinian men that are dying in Gaza? And she was just like, what? Like, what? Out of my entire book, that is the thing that you took away. I've told a story about displacement. I've told a story about intergenerational trauma. I've told you what happened in Palestine and how this family were forced out. Out of that entire story, you have taken this thing because it is the thing that fuels your existing prejudice. And it's just shocking.
That's so hard. And I think that any sort of marginalized, if you're coming from any marginalized community, it's such a hard thing to navigate as an author, because you need to write fully realized people. You need to write people who have flaws. And yet there will always be, you know, queer authors get it, you know, and Jewish authors as well. The book I'm just finishing up right now is historical fiction set in the 17th century. And it's looking at history through an anarchist lens. And one of the things that it's really an attempt by me to write some anti-Zionist Jewish historical literature, even though it's taking place hundreds of years before, you know, the founding of Israel. I think so much Jewish literature and Jewish fiction, Jewish authors are afraid to have a Jewish villain in there. You know, they're just, Jews were always the victim, and we were always, you know, it was just the Christians against us, and you know, we were being oppressed, and not showing the way that Jews themselves were complicit in systems of oppression that were just sort of inescapable in Europe at that time. So like one of the characters in the book is a slave trader, a Jewish slave trader in the Ottoman Empire. Jews in Christian Europe did not have slaves because slave ownership was not as common. It happened, but it wasn't as widespread in Christendom. And Jews were too poor and oppressed to be of a slave owning class. But in the Ottoman Empire, where Jews were considerably more able to amass more wealth and rise to like a middle class status, and slave ownership was very normalized. And this wasn't chattel slavery. It was like more like indentured servitude, but often like from hostages taken from like wars. Jews were, there were whole entire like tracts of Talmud that were written about how to treat your slaves and stuff. Obviously, this has been dropped from like the Jewish historical literature because it's like shameful that we did this. There was so much like rabbinical writing on like what to do when your slave gets knocked up and stuff like that. I think it's important that we are able to include those aspects of our history. One, because this like Jewish persecution complex that like we are always the victims prevents Jews from seeing when our community does violence upon others, which we have been doing throughout history. Like we're all there's no group of people that if they become wealthy and dominant in a society haven't been involved in oppressing the people beneath them. And so I think it's really important that we have literature that reflects that. And at the same time, though, it's in the back of your head where like anything I say negative about my people could be used against us, but I mean, obviously I think it's important. I think it's important to reflect historical reality. I think it's important to be able to write villainous characters. Whatever demographic you're from does not, make you a superior person or an untouchable person. In fact, it's that sort of mindset that allows one group to feel superior to others. So I feel for Itaf and any authors facing that challenge, and that's really just totally a failure on the part of the readers to be able to hold that nuance. And like you said, it just seems like they ignored the rest of the text and the nuance that was there.
Absolutely. I think like any minority community, when you're part of any minority community, that almost like burden of representation that you feel like it's very real and it's very heavy, and we see it, in all kind of spaces and sectors, but especially in literature. Like if I tell a story of a family, why is it that some people will automatically then be like, okay, well, you're now telling the story of all Muslims or all Jews or all Palestinians, but we don't impose that same on white writers. We understand that this is one story and that there is nuance to the story, but, we have authors that they only write stories about violence, and, all these like Harlan Coben, who writes about crime that always involves murder. And often the murder, in fact, I think his characters are always all white really anyway, but like there's no then assumption that, that means that all white people are committing these murders. Like we just don't have that. And it's just very difficult, I think, to navigate. But I would like to talk a little bit about your book, The Free People's Village. You have already told us about the final scene of the book, and I have read around it, and it sounds amazing because it is based on, I guess the main focus of the book is about climate change and the world that we are living in and we are creating, and the world that we kind of need to save from ourselves, really. But if you could tell us a little bit about the book, but also what really drove you to write it.
Yeah, so the book takes place in an alternate timeline of 2020, where in the United States, the Democrats had won the 2000 election. So Al Gore won instead of George W. Bush. And instead of declaring a war on terror, 9/11 never happened. Instead of declaring a war on terror, President Al Gore declared a war on climate change. So this is like the liberal fantasy, right? And what you see over the course of the book is that, at first it seems like, wow, there's really been a lot of green solar improvements to the US. Like there's electric trains going everywhere. And, there's certain, communities that are all solar panels on all the roofs and everything. But as the book progresses, you figure out that this infrastructure has been applied very unequally and is really only benefiting wealthy white communities, which is in line with the way that democratic policies are always enacted, because they're enacted along neoliberal principles, which is like, we can only do things that make rich people richer in the United States. It's like, you cannot do anything politically that does not enrich already rich people. And so it came from a place of like disgust and frustration with the Democratic Party and frustration with the number of liberals who are vote blue no matter who, and who, sabotaged more leftist candidates and more progressive values in election after election since 2000 in order to, because they thought it was politically expedient. And so I think it will resonate with a lot of readers right now who are very frustrated with the Democratic Party, as I was when I wrote this book, and maybe feeling like coming to a realization that like Democrats will not save us. So the Democratic president, the Democrats have had complete control of the government for 20 years in this book. And still there's a war has been declared, a climate change focused war has been declared in the Amazon. Like, climate change has become the excuse to over police Black communities, blaming them for climate inaction. Sort of all the troubles we see in our world have just been sort of greenwashed, And so that came from a place of like frustration as a climate person with Democratic inaction on climate change, frustration as a leftist from being told that like my only option is to vote for Democrats every 4 years in order to make change in the world. And that is not going to save us. So yeah, that was kind of the motivating drive of the book, is just to show what I think, kind of to expose what the world might look like if Democrats, if you kind of called them at their bluff and if you gave them all the power, because they're always having excuses, right? Oh, we can't do climate legislation because of Joe Manchin or Kristen Sinema. There's these 2 senators that are holdouts, or, oh, we have to compromise with the Republican Party. Right now, Joe Biden is working on the most harsh, violent, restrictive immigration policy, so much worse than anything that came out under Trump. And what is the excuse? Oh, we have to compromise with Republicans on this. Like, it's a disgusting piece of legislation. And he's fueling this incredibly violent genocide in Palestine, and cut aid to UNRWA yesterday, like, because Israel said 7 employees of UNRWA were involved with Hamas. And so, yeah, just that deep-seated disgust and betrayal from the Democratic Party. And so, the book is about leftist radical organizing. It's about a group of it's actually about a punk band that end up trying to save their house from being demolished for a new electromagnetic highway is going to go through where their house is. And it's also going to be destroying this historical Black community that their punk band's warehouse is in. And so they end up sort of joining forces with these local radical organizers. And there's an occupation movement springs up similar to like the Occupy Wall Street movement or some of the protest occupations that happened in 2020, like in Oakland and stuff. And, their clashes with the police and how they are trying to forge a revolution within the very difficult situation of like protesting in the United States. Yeah, at that time.
I mean, I feel your frustration also, like in, the UK also cut their funding to UNRWA for the same reason. We have insanely harsh and dehuman immigration laws. Our government plans to send asylum seekers to Rwanda. So, we have like all kinds of stuff going on too. And that frustration, I think, is felt everywhere around the world at the moment. So, it sounds like a really important book to explore some of those things. And when it comes to climate change, I still feel like conversations about climate change are very limited. They kind of spring up. There might be like a little bit of a like a buzz or something, and then they'll die down again. And they seem very much focused to like academic circles and boardrooms or climate activists, and that's kind of it. And it's probably our biggest shame at the moment one of our biggest shames at the moment, that we're not taking it more seriously. And even with the genocide in Gaza, there's a massive climate catastrophe going on right there at the moment with that as well. It is so tied into every single thing that is happening around the world at the moment. So what are some of the things that you really wanted to bring out about climate change in this book, but more generally as well?
In this book, one of the things that I was really targeting was like greenwashing and the ways that, liberal politicians and corporations will hijack your desire to do something good for the environment in order to enrich themselves and to play sort of lip service to that, and how to better spot greenwashing, whether it's in like a consumer culture, like any kind of consumerism. There's so much consumerism that is, branded as greenwashing, where really you're just buying more shit that you don't need to replace what you had that was already functional with something that's like bamboo made, but if you were actually to look into like the manufacturing process and where did it ship from and everything, like the more you buy shit, the more you are contributing to the climate crisis. Try not to buy shit. So greenwashing is something I target in this book. Also the way I think increasingly, the book presupposes a eventual alt-right co-option, like the far right starting to co-opt the climate movement and saying that they are the only solution. And I do still see that coming. There are alt-right spaces now that are increasingly like vegan Nazis is like a growing thing. And they will posit themselves as the solution because fascists always claim like, well, we can get things done. And so I worry we get to a point in the climate crisis where people are so desperate for any kind of action that they'll turn towards eco-fascism, to try to, do something to address the impending enormous collapse of food systems and mass migrations and all of that is happening. There's a war declared over, water resources and mismanagement of water resources in the book that I think, and also the ways that the book is looking to expose ways that climate, a lot of white liberal climate activism or climate projects really are just used as an excuse to expand colonialism and white supremacy. And, you do see it in Israel, and, this lie that Israel made the desert bloom by planting trees that were inappropriate for the region that have now led to massive forest fires, trees that poison the soil and made it unsuitable for agriculture, and trees that displace people. Like many, many Palestinian villages were just depopulated because Israel said, we're going to make a national park here. Leave your homes. Like, we're taking these houses for ecological reasons. And then planted these trees that are now contributing to horrible, unprecedented forest fires because they're not, native to the region. And Israel had no appreciation for the ecosystem that was there. I want people to be a little bit more savvy I think after reading my book and in spotting some of those tactics. That was part of it.
One of the things that I'm particularly interested in when it comes to climate change is looking at the inequality of it all. And I mean, you spoke about it already, but if we look at the countries that are overtly facing some of the worst implications of climate change, we're looking at Bangladesh, we're looking at Pakistan, we're looking at, countries in Asia, some parts of Africa that are facing huge natural disasters, floods and tsunamis, especially as a result of climate change that is caused by capitalism, right? It is the result of industrialization, mass production, not finding sustainable ways to produce energy, all of that kind of stuff. And the people that are being the most impacted by it are the people that are already so vulnerable and are thousands of miles away from the people that are producing the bulk of it. And I'm not saying that, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, that they don't produce their own, harmful gases. And of course they do, right? Everyone needs energy. Of course they do. But the proportion of it, and then the sense of responsibility, because then what's coming out of that is this focus on individual responsibility. And I believe that we are all responsible, and we all should be recycling, and all the things that we should be making the right choices. Absolutely, we should. But it goes hand in hand with actually the powers that be, governments and states, making also the right decisions, because they have the biggest impact. I think it's gone beyond just individual responsibility. I don't think we can save the world even if everybody does recycle, when you still have major corporations that are getting away with, poisoning the Niger Delta and doing all kinds of things that they're doing around the world. I wondered what your thoughts on this are, because I'm sure you have many.
You're spot on. Yeah, your analysis I agree with completely. Yeah, the countries that are most responsible for climate change are in the global north, and they will be least impacted by climate change. Although we're feeling the impacts here. I mean, I live in Houston. We have now experienced like more and more brutal summers every year, drought, and then the combination of like drought and then hurricanes and flooding, like one or the other during the summer, more and more over the past few years. So, the global north will not be untouched, but certainly the countries that will face the most. We're also in the north, we have more infrastructure and wealth to do climate mitigation and disaster response.
Yeah.
Eventually, the scale of destruction will outweigh the resources that we have at a much later time than countries in the global south that aren't able to mobilize billions of dollars at the drop of a hat if there's a hurricane or a flooding event or drought or whatever it is. So yeah, we're looking at a really bleak future.
Yeah.
And yeah, certainly the people most responsible are the corporations most responsible are not going to feel the brunt of those effects. And that's why, again, I think leftist organizing, the organizing around Palestine, a lot of people have said like this Free Palestine movement, it's so important because if it succeeds, it saves all of us, and actually, I've shifted the brunt of my activism in recent years. I was always a climate person, but I do more now, honestly, quite a bit more activism. My energy goes towards Palestine rather than that, because I really do see it as sort of the crux of the whole world. When Palestinians are free, then we will all be free. And so much is tied to their struggle, and just sort of, if we are able to take down the forces that are suppressing their freedom, then we can do anything. So I find the movement very important and inspiring and deeply embedded in the climate fight in ways I can't always articulate, but it's certainly there. And also in the fight against like police abolitionism, all of our police forces here in the U.S. are trained in Israel. There's this deadly exchange program where our cops take cues from the IDF or the IOF, and we cannot make any meaningful change in government without being able to mass organize, without being tear gassed and kettled and shot at and, treated as criminals for exercising our rights to free speech, which is increasingly the case in this country. So I see all of it as deeply, deeply connected.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think the Palestinian liberation movement it's not simply about a person or a group of people that are physically more powerful or that are like physically locking people in a place. There are huge structures and politics and power and systems that are allowing this to happen the way that it is happening. And those are also the same systems that are allowing the destruction of the environment to happen at the rate that it's happening, tied into capitalism and all of that. So absolutely, I really agree with you. And my final question for you is that, as you said, the world is bleak. The future is looking quite bleak. But we're also at the moment, obviously, witnessing, I think for the first time, a genocide on this scale, but also sort of with the brutality that's coming forward. Over the last recent years, there have been very awful images coming out of Syria as well. So I don't mean to say that it's the first time that we're seeing things like this. The world has been hugely problematic for years, for absolutely decades. But it is very difficult for a lot of people to, find spaces to process that and to really channel it to the right activism and the right sort of, using the right sort of language. But obviously you're steeped in this activism, and you're also reading to educate and empower yourself and inform yourself. What do you think are some of the things that we can do to just keep going when it feels so bleak and we're seeing things? There still hasn't been a call for a permanent ceasefire, and all of these things that are continuing to happen. What are some of the things that you'd suggest that we do to keep going?
Yeah, it's something I've wrestled with, sustaining this energy is very important and very difficult, I think, for everyone. And I don't want to lie and say it's not been for me. And when in October and November, I was putting out a video every single day about Palestine, and I quit writing. I mean, it was all I was doing. I was using all of my free time and work time to do this, because they were, often like video essays. Like I was researching all day and then shooting and then editing and cutting it. And I couldn't keep up that pace because we do live in capitalism, and I do have to like sell a book this year, and I had to, my family relies on that income. Like I had to eventually find a more sustainable balance. So I think that is one thing, is like, it's more important to me, it's more important to continue showing up long term than to just sort of go full out for a couple of weeks and then you burn out and then you're stepping away. But it can be very hard to do that, because when something like this is happening so urgently, like how can you justify taking any time to rest, But I think you do need to, because again, the Palestine is not going to be freed in a week or a month. It is going to be years at least. Like this is a long haul fight. And if you're activated and you're into it, take care of yourself, find balance. You do have to find time for rest and for your work that sustains you literally, financially, and for the relationships that sustain you emotionally, and taking time to experience joy and so that you can go on, because you really will just get burned out. You need to set it down and take a break from time to time and then come back to it, So I'm more on like a once a week trying to put out some quality content. I'm also trying to prioritize like putting out, again, something like more quality than just adding to the noise constantly and just like posting just to post things. Mm-hmm. And also asking like, if like I've seen 10 other TikToks talking about this issue, like I'm probably not going to talk about it because like it's covered, like people are talking about it. So like I'm really focusing on the books and the reading, because that's my niche of book talk. I'm an author, I'm a reader, I have a book talk account. So like, can I continue doing that? Mm-hmm. Trying to just be more strategic with my time. So yeah, I think that all of those things are really important, but but also, it's a balance between making sure you're taking care of yourself, making sure you're, mentally healthy and taking care of your physical health and doing the things you need to do to stay alive in capitalism. And then also, though, not using that as an excuse to completely shut down and check out and stop bearing witness and stop being a part of the conversation. It's really, really been hard for me to find that balance. A lot of feelings of guilt and uncertainty and pressure. And, people have responded so positively, overwhelming. Well, obviously, except for like, Zionists, but the vast majority, of people following me and everything have been so positive and so grateful for all the content that I've been creating over the last couple of months. And so you feel a great obligation to them to keep going, and also a ton of pressure to not let them down, not say the wrong thing. It can create a lot of anxiety. And even if you're not a content creator, if you don't have like a platform, but maybe you're showing up in person to, events and organizing spaces, it's okay if you don't make every single one, like we all are doing this live together. Like you have to live your life. And again, you'll get burnt out. You'll get unhealthy if you are not taking enough time to rest and sort of recuperate. So we all are shouldering this burden together. I'm incredibly heartened. I swing between like sort of despair and cautious optimism, because obviously the genocide is so horrible. There's so much grief and despair that, and really understanding the horrors of humanity in the world in like a deeper way than ever before. At the same time, the level of organizing, the level of outcry, the level that people are questioning the mass media, these, liberal bullshit politicians, like the awakening that is happening and that is being sustained 4 months later. I mean, it is not as, I think it's being sustained pretty well, honestly. Like the energy, again, there's still big protests happening, big things being shut down. Like the airport was shut down yesterday in Houston 4 months later. Rarely in my life, maybe never in my lifetime have I seen sort of a explosion of organizing and protest movement last this long. And it doesn't really show any signs of stopping. And I find that extremely inspiring and a positive that you can look to if you're feeling so much despair and grief among all this. Look, get out there in community, go to an action that always, for medical reasons, I haven't been able to be at as many. Being 9 months pregnant, I can say now, I get really dizzy standing on my feet for a long time. So I haven't been like at every single protest, this time around. But just anytime I'm like out in community, like go to a Jewish Voice for Peace meetup, for me, it's like really helpful to be around other anti-Zionist Jews. It's always really good to be in community with others.
Yeah, I think I was thinking actually just this morning generally about community care over self-care. And sometimes of course we need some self-care. We need to take a bath and light a candle and do whatever it is that makes us feel better. But I think right now more than ever, what we need is community care. It's about figuring out who your community is. And it will look different for every single person. It might be a space you have online. It might just be your family and friends, or it might be something way bigger. And to lean into that, really lean into it and to turn to it for help. Because the people you're in community with often understand what you're going through and will be able to create space for you to talk about the way that you're feeling and to help you work through it. And I think now more than ever, coming together, whatever that looks like for you, is so important. And I hope that more people find their community and find that space. I think we're kind of needed to survive right now more than ever. So yeah. But Sim, thank you so much for your time today. It has been so wonderful speaking to you. And yeah, I can't wait to see what you continue putting out into the world. And good luck for everything you have coming your way in the next few weeks and months. A very exciting time of change in your life as well. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a great talk.
If you enjoy this episode, please follow, like, and subscribe on your podcast platform of choice and connect with me on social media. I'd really appreciate it if you could rate and leave a review, as it helps more people find the show. Also, if you'd like to go that one step further and help support the podcast and make sure I'm able to put out more episodes just like this, come and find me on patreon.com/the Diverse Bookshelf Podcast.